Hello everyone, welcome to this new video segment. You may not recognize me with my new hairstyle, but trying something new out here. I hope you like it. Welcome any affirming comments on the discussion board about my new look. This video we're looking at the last chapter of Bouyer, chapter 12 in the conclusion, dealing with the mystical life. And such a wonderful book, this Bouyer's Introduction to the Spiritual Life. Really enjoyed teaching from this book all semester. I hope you've gained a lot from it as well. I think it's a real masterpiece in terms of a compendium of Catholic spirituality. And the way he finishes off the book with this vocation to the mystical life, really for every human soul, approaching union with God is, I think, very appropriate way to conclude it. Also, at the end of this video, I'll talk some about Pope Benedict XVI's first encyclical letter of 2005, Deus Caritas Est, Part 1, and the beginning there. So, Bouyer, page 359, the mystical life, he suggests, refers primarily to an activity of God within us. A great way to put it. When we look at, for instance, the Carmelite itinerary of prayers we studied in Schulis, as well as the classic paradigm of spiritual ascent from purification to illumination to contemplation, or what's also called the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way. Within this ascent, we're moving from an active disposition of prayer to a more passive one. And in the heights of prayer, moving from cataphatic to apophatic stages of prayer. Again, cataphatic from the Greek kataphasis. Phasis like a statement or an assertion, phrase. Kata, according to this speaking about God, all the names we have for God, all the things we say in prayer. We're moving from cataphatic to apophatic, not leaving cataphatic behind for good, but it's a dialectical movement upwards, back and forth between cataphatic, apophatic, but still the apophatic, you could say, takeoff, being propelled, launched into toward the mystical union with God. Apophasis, moving away from words and assertions. Because the object of our desire, the object, quote unquote, being God, the object of this contemplative itinerary is union with God. God and God's essence transcends everything we have to say about God. Even everything God has to say about himself, so that we can understand God to some degree, know about God, enter into liturgical communion with God, have philosophy, have theology, but in God's essence, there's a complete transcendence of all of this language. We cannot pin the tail on God, so to speak, with any of our theological language. God transcends everything about it. St. Augustine said, this classic quote, if you comprehend it, it is not God. If we circumscribe, we pretend to circumscribe God by a predicate of God or a name of God, God eludes that by definition. So we can fall into what's called conceptual idolatry, even of our best language we have about God. So we're going to use the language for sure, and it does point us in the direction of God. It does transport us toward God, but in the end, words start to fall short of this mystical encounter whose privileged language is silence, where it's a full experience, but full to the degree that words aren't getting in the way so much, but they've served as springboards to put us in contact with and communion with God. So the mystical life refers primarily to an activity of God within us, moving from this active phase of prayer toward a completely passive phase where God is doing everything in the soul. This is very exciting in the life of prayer. But on a practical level, for God to be doing everything in the soul, we have to carve out quiet time to be with God. There's no question about it. And just like we might talk about physical exercise, is really helpful for human living. It really helps to channel stress and anxiety and all these things to be have physical exercise, at least take a walk, at least do some kind of exercise. Very important because of our embodied existence. Do something active in our bodies. With the spiritual life, it's the same way with all these spiritual exercises. But then we find ourselves in a place in this end zone, so to speak, of God acting within us in amazing ways. Bouyer talks about the relationship between asceticism and mysticism, two distinct things but very much related. It's the same as the relationship between the cross and resurrection. So as asceticism is to the cross of Christ, so is mysticism to the resurrection of Christ. And he says this very striking thing on page 360 about the one who undergoes martyrdom self-identifies with the resurrected Christ. And when we read accounts of people who were martyred for their faith in Christ, it's really amazing what we find, how they had a radiance about them, how they had a very serene countenance. They seem to exhibit all this peace as their life is being what seems to be stolen from them prematurely. And it's because they're so united with Christ in this act of greatest witness that it's that Passover from cross to resurrection. It's where the cross achieves its goal that's been there all along. And the suffering gives way to salvation. So this is beautiful. Asceticism moving toward mysticism. So asceticism itself is a means to an end. This mystical union with God, a loving knowledge of God, and not just a knowledge, but a communion of persons, a communion of spiritual being, personal spiritual being. Bouyer, as a former Protestant Lutheran, laments what happens oftentimes in Protestant theology, in which the Protestant theologians can tend to adopt a resolutely anti-mystical attitude to the spiritual life. He says this on page 362. And I know what he's getting at there for sure, and you can read more about what he says. But I guess the point is, hopefully, we learn not to adopt a resolutely anti-mystical attitude to prayer, to our spiritual life. This could, yeah, I don't want to say too much about this. I'm trying to keep the video within 15 minutes. So in any case, it's just that we shouldn't be afraid of the mystical life. It's related especially to the sacramental life of the church. But I would suggest there's a dialectical relationship between the mystical life and what might be called the evangelical life, that missionary, apostolic way of being church, the outward-facing kind of church. But there's a complementary dialectic between interiority and exteriority, and doesn't need to be one or the other, but both both and so this, to think about a mystical evangelization or an evangelical missionary mysticism. This is reinforced by a concept that Bouyer uses on page 369 called chiaroscuro, this alteration of light and darkness. He's talked about this before, I think, in the book. But in the spiritual life, again, the cataphatic, apophatic, back and forth. We think of something like St. John of the Cross and the dark night of the soul. The point isn't the darkness. It's the passover into the light. On page 371 and 72, Bouyer says that this mystical life involves a yearning for fellowship. The Greek word is koinonia. We see throughout the New Testament. Fellowship, participation in divine life, communion with other persons. This desire to hold conscious communion, he says, with the other. On page 382, building on this, the goal of the mystical life is irrevocable union with God. The unity of a perennial plurality of persons. That's a little Wallenfang alliteration there. A perennial plurality of persons, also known as the communio sanctorum, the communion of angels and saints, and communion with the most holy Trinity. So this is incredibly exciting. It's also called the liturgical synaxis, where we gather together around the salvific table of the Lord, the altar of sacrifice, to worship the one who made us, the one who is saving us. The mystical life tends toward this communion of persons. It's again another dialectic between solitude and communion that goes on in the mystical life. Not completely one or the other, but even when we say solitude in the mystical life, it's communal because there's always God in the soul. But to grow in that intimacy with God, the solitude and the silence are absolutely necessary. We must seek it out, and we must let God work on our hearts. Speaking of hearts, Pope Benedict's encyclical, God is Love. The Christian heart is one that is charged with both you could say erotic love and agapic love. Even St. Dionysius the Areopagite calls God in Greek by the names Eros and Agape. It's in the tradition. And Benedict gets at this well because these loves, while they seem opposed, these Greek concepts, Eros being that magnetic yearning, ultimate yearning of the soul for the true, the good, and the beautiful, but these united transcendentals, and then agape, that self-donating, self-sacrificial, self-giving love. Both of these are meant to work together, to work in tandem in the Christian life, according to the pattern of divine love. Christianity is not a kind of pure stoicism. It's not dealing with the quenching or the extinguishing of desire, but the transformation of desire. That desire would be oriented properly to the only hook that can bear its weight, and that is God. The only one that can bear the magnitude of the desires of the heart is God. So it's a very dangerous, idolatry is a very dangerous thing in our human experience, because it's when we're diverting all of the magnitude of our desire onto something less than God. But it's a desire that's meant to be for God and God alone, in the sense. And as we grow in the spiritual life, idolatry becomes all the more dangerous. The higher altitudes that God lifts us to in the spiritual life, the further we have to fall. and it's very true. So we have to stay vigilant in the spiritual life, and Bouyer gives us so many good insights as to how to do this. And then Pope Benedict in this this letter, this encyclical on the relationship between Eros and Agape. For the sake of time, I love to go line by line and just unpack the document, but I'll let you do that on your own in the discussion board. And it's been great traveling through this Bouyer book this semester, and look forward to hearing your final thoughts on it.